this lesson, we'll discuss the limitations of classic hardware and its effects on music composition. More specifically, we'll review the Nintendo Entertainment System or NES sound hardware to determine how we can emulate its limitations with our current setup so we can produce similar sounding music. Let's go! The NES had the capability of producing 5 different types of sounds. The 12.5% pulse wave, the 25% pulse wave, the 50% pulse wave, the triangle wave, and lastly, low-resolution noise. Next, let's discuss the available sound channels on the NES. In addition to its wave generation, the NES also had the limitation of producing sound in only 5 channels. Compare that to the virtually unlimited number of channels we have available in our modern digital audio workstations today. The first and second channels were designated to produce any one of the various pulse waves. These channels and the pulse wave types were typically used for melodies and counter melodies. The third channel was reserved for our triangle wave and was typically used for bass lines. It could also be used for bass drums or a combination of both. The fourth channel produced low-resolution noise and was typically used for drums and percussion. The fifth and final channel was reserved for playing delta pulse code modulation or DPCM samples. Let's not worry about that term for now as it's pretty technical and we're merely attempting to emulate the sound. Essentially, this channel will allow us to use some low-resolution samples of live sounds, such as a voice or other instrument. We'll be using a plugin to mimic the low-resolution analog to digital conversion of the NES hardware. Here are a few examples.
Blades of Steel.
We'll take a more in-depth look at these sound types and discover what we can do with them a bit later. For now, we have to tackle one other important limitation to consider when making chiptunes. If you're a seasoned musician, you will most likely already be familiar with monophony and polyphony, but for those who are not, let's briefly discuss these terms. Monophony and polyphony are musical terms that distinguish music containing either one voice or many, one instrument playing a single melody, or multiple instruments playing multiple melodies. Essentially, we're talking about musical layers. To help you understand the differences, let's take a look at a few familiar instruments. This is a clarinet. The clarinet is a monophonic instrument. This means it can only play one note at a time. For instance, it could not play a chord without the use of an arpeggio. We'll discuss that term later. For now, let's contrast this with the piano. The piano is a polyphonic instrument. It can play multiple notes simultaneously. This is a relatively simple concept, but it's critical to understanding how we can make our chiptunes sound authentic. Let's make a quick template for our NES sound channels in Logic Pro. Open a new project in Logic Pro and create a software instrument with the magical 8-bit plug patch. Open the plugin settings on this channel strip and make sure the oscillator kind or wave type is set to square. Close the settings and on your keyboard press Command and the D key together a few times to create 4 duplicate channels. Go into each channel's magical 8-bit plug settings and set each to a different wave type. In the end, you should have all the wave types covered. I'll also rename all the channels here. And close the library window. Lastly, let's create an empty audio channel for our DPCM samples. This depicts how we'll initially look at our 5 basic NES sound types or waveforms in Logic Pro. Now, thinking back on the 5 NES sound channels and our discussion about monophony and polyphony, it's important to realize that each channel here is monophonic. That means that only one note or pitch can be produced in each channel. Now, Logic Pro will certainly let us play multiple notes on each of these channels, but the NES would not. So again, if we want to create authentic sounding chiptunes, we'll need to stick to monophony in each channel. With that in mind, let's create an empty MIDI region by right-clicking an empty area in the timeline and selecting Create Empty MIDI Region. Let's make sure we have this lined up to the start of the first measure. Now, while holding the Option key down on your keyboard, click the MIDI region and drag it down to the next channel. As you see, holding down the Option key allows us to create a carbon copy of the selected region. Do this again until you have a region on all 3 pulse channels and the triangle channel. Now remember, even though we can see the square, 25% pulse, and 12.5% pulse wave channels here in Logic, there were only 2 available sound channels to play those 3 wave types on the NES. So if we are to create authentic sounding NES music, we can only use 2 of these 3 sound types at once. So for the purposes of this demonstration, let's delete the region on the 12.5% pulse channel. Just click it to highlight it and press the delete key on your keyboard. To better understand the concepts we've discussed in this lesson, let's outline a basic C triad using the empty regions we've created here. The C triad consists of the following notes: C, E, and G. Double-click on the triangle channel's empty region to open it in the piano roll. Now drop a note on C2 by holding the Command key and clicking your left mouse button. If a short note was created, grab the right end of the note and drag it out to the length of a quarter note, or 25% of this one measure region. Next, click on the 25% pulse empty region and drop a note on E3. If you're not familiar with the piano notes, don't worry about it for now, just do as you see here. Lastly, click on the square empty region and drop a note on G3. Press your P key to close the piano roll, and zoom in by holding Command while using the down and right arrows on your keyboard. Now, press the spacebar to play the sounds. What you hear is a C triad spread out amongst 3 of the 5 available NES sound channels. Remember, the first 2 channels are used for the 3 types of pulse waves, 12.5%, 25%, and 50%, the last of which is a square wave. The remaining 2 channels could only play noise and DPCM samples. So, effectively, just playing a C triad, we've eaten up all of our channels that are capable of producing melodies and harmonies. This seems pretty limited, but we'll discuss some creative ways to make some amazing textures and complex chord structures within these limitations. That's quite enough for this lesson. You may want to let that sink in for a few minutes before moving on. When you're ready, I'll see you in the next video.